redo my little review on this Juentai radio, and we've got the stuff on this. It's got a big fat heat sink. It's an aluminum body, seems pretty robust to me. This is the 6188 Mini. Not a huge radio. If you see it in comparison to my hand, it's not very big. And what I was looking for when I bought this was, I was thinking, okay, I want a vehicle mount radio for something that would be compatible with the Baofeng packages, and not necessarily just a Baofeng with a cigarette lighter plug and that sort of a thing. The Baofengs are what they call a low-duty cycle radio, which means if you're talking out in the lot, there's not much of a heat sink there, there's not a whole lot of battery there, but you can extend that. But the whole system on those is not made for heavy use. It's really short-term emergency use radio. A group I've been involved with standardized with the Baofengs because they were cheap, they're readily available, not a major cost item to distribute those to some people, and it seemed to work okay. Almost immediately after doing that, we started to have some minor failures on the Baofengs, like the screen's going bad, or one button starts getting buggy, but we could still use them. I noticed the transmit part, you set them up for a single frequency, they seem to still work. Another guy with another group that I had met a few months ago, they went with another Baofeng model, which was a single channel, which means that you'd have to program it on a computer. Once it's programmed on a computer, it's got much fewer buttons on it, and they seem to really like that, because on the UV5R, you hit the wrong button, you've changed things, you've got that problem. I've run into that issue with Juentai radio as far as vehicle mount. It's something to be aware of. It's something that the professional users of the radios have some criticisms of it. The professional technicians have other criticisms of it. One of the things I'm looking at is that, hey, I just wanted a vehicle mobile radio with a little more power and the ability to take a better antenna than a standard Baofeng, and I wanted to keep that on budget. I wanted to keep it around $100, and that's where this thing fits the bill. It's got a big fat aluminum heat sink on it. It's got a decent speaker. It's capable of handling more radio traffic than a Baofeng ever will. And if you're trying to coordinate with several people, this is going to be important, because the guy who's doing the command and coordination is going to be the guy who's got a lot of back and forth conversation, compared to the guy who mainly is listening to the news that's coming through on the radio and then occasionally calls in and report. And that's where I think it's important to have mobile radios in the vehicles, so that if you need to have a real conversation with, let's say, another element someplace else, whether it's somebody above you, below you, or somebody you need to coordinate with, you want to get to the vehicle radio and say, hey, let's have that conversation on the other radio, not just the handheld. And it's not that expensive of an investment. The other thing about these is you can set these up on a backpack setup, that sort of a thing, but when we look at the microphone unit on these things, it's got a lot of stuff going on. It's got some controls and some buttons, and that's where a lot of your buttons are on this thing. As I've been going through the menus on the radio, I'm finding it tricky and complex. I'm not going to joke around. This is tricky and complex stuff to use. That's why for most people, I would still say, hey, get a CB radio. If you have a radio expert in your group, or you're willing to spend some time and energy getting these things going, you can get a lot done with these Juentai radios. Another big aspect of it is you can set them up in the 460 megahertz range, so that you can communicate with the people that are using the FRS and the GMRS radio. It's tricky, but it can be done. It has that capability. Now, as far as your antenna situation goes, I've been back and forth with a few different radio experts, and the consensus is that even though a standard common CB antenna will plug right into the antenna jack on these things, everything will work, but it would only work short term, because the CB antennas are not tuned the same way as this is going to be requiring. So you can only do that short term. You have to use a specialized ham radio dual band antenna for these. What was recommended to me as far as the Amazon product goes is one that's made by an outfit called Nagoya, and apparently it's named after some town or province in Japan where these things are made. What I did was I modified a CB antenna mount by drilling a hole bigger. Also on the CB antennas, there's a plastic plug that goes in at the base of the antenna, and I could set that up with the springs to give it a lot of springiness so that it will, you know, if I run into trees or something, we're not going to have that issue. On this Nagoya antenna, it's got springiness on this part. These parts are actually rigid, and this little assembly with these three little things is sold separately, and it's not mandatory to go with it, but it was only about a $10 upgrade. By adding the two, it's supposed to make the whole system more efficient. And this is where the plugs on this end of the radio, on the other end, it's of the antenna cord, it's the same as a CB. On this end, it's different, but apparently they're not cross-compatible as far as the electronics and the transmit works. Even though they will bolt right into each other, it's apparently a really bad thing to bolt the wrong one in. The whole package was maybe $125. One of the things that happens with this Nagoya thing was, in order to get this cable, I had to buy a mount for hatchback cars and then throw away the mount and keep the cable. So I ended up, you know, it was like $18 for that. Effectively, you're paying $18 for the cable. The cable is a 3-meter cable, so it's pretty long. It's like a 10-foot cable, and if not longer. And that's if you're going to stick this thing up in a tree or do other experimental antenna stuff like a lot of ham radio people do. I think it's going to work fine. Yeah, if you're looking for inexpensive vehicle radio capability, if somebody has a better recommendation in this price range, I want to hear it. Go ahead and put it in the comment range of the stuff. I am not claiming to be the radio expert out there. I'm making these videos as a you know, as a former military user. I was not in an actual police agency. I was in a what they call the Department of Public Safety, I think they call it, with regard to a large resort where police, fire, emergency services was all rolled up into one agency because they'd only keep one guy on duty late at night, and we would call county services for any sort of backup that was beyond what our role was. We called county services for that. And so really the most important piece of equipment on us was going to be that radio, not weapons. And that's just the way things worked. We were supposed to verify, filter the calls. Extremely critically important to have a dispatcher who's paying attention, who's going to make sure you're there. That really is your lifeline. And that's where the vehicle radio is extremely important. And I think that's where a lot of people in a lot of survival groups are not quite getting it. Okay? It's one thing among experts to argue which radio is better than others, what communication's better than others. You know, there's a tremendous number of people whose extent of dealing with this stuff is cell phones and Facebook, smartphones and Facebook. There was a situation a few years ago with a Marine by the name of Charles Dyer. He'd been falsely accused of a pretty bad crime. There were some people who wanted to coordinate helping him go on the run for a little while. No two-way radio usage whatsoever. They were actually, the woman who was trying to help him get away, supposedly, was coordinating everything through Facebook and a Google phone. Obviously, their security was compromised almost immediately into the operation. And they were, they cornered and captured, multiple locations were raided, and some of those very same people would say, oh, well, we don't want you using a two-way radio. We don't want you having that. They'll be criticizing you for it, and they'll be blocking and coming up with all sorts of excuses. And when they do want to go shortwave, it's some dickhead who's broadcasting a bunch of garbage that's the same stuff he's posting on his Facebook page. And this is part of what's going to have to separate out people who want to develop real operational capabilities versus those who don't. And this has to do with personal survival, backwoods activities, any of that type of stuff, you gotta have that two-way radio vehicle communications. It does have its own challenges. The equipment's difficult to program. It's difficult to use. Start out with a CB radio. If you're already using the Baofeng handhelds, go ahead and look into these Juentai radios. They're available on Amazon. I'll put some links in the video here. Basically, it's going to operate on the same frequency ranges as your Baofeng radios, and it can be programmed for the frequency ranges that are used on your inexpensive FRS, GMRS radios. And the licensing on those isn't very difficult. A lot of people would consider it optional. I consider it mandatory if you're doing official activities. And there is no restriction on owning the equipment, but there's some really tricky stuff you got to learn with it. And so with a shout out to Survival Tech Nord, some of the other preppers out of Europe who are going to be more radio and vehicle intensive with a lot of their stuff, we'll continue the conversation. We'll consider this a series of corrections on my old radios, but a lot of this has to do with these guys, the jargon that they use, and I don't want to get too wrapped up in elitist jargon over capabilities that people need to have, need to study, need to develop.